Is your
crypto
making too much
money
all the time? Is your
crypto
constantly
pumping to the moon?
driving you crazy? Think there's no answer? You're so stupid.
Well, 2024 is behind us, and last I checked, Bitcoin topped out at $69,000 back in November of 2021. That means if you believe in the 4-year cycle, we are less than 2 years away from the next top. Well, there's no time to prepare like the present, so let's talk about what happens if we make too much money. I'm Zenith, welcome to Hexaco Space Force. Let's get into it and start asking the real questions.
Begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And
What coins
do you want?
Have you done your moon math lately? It's time to ask the question. So, what are your numbers? What could that mean? There could be many things. We're going to cover 2 of the big questions. First off, what's your go-away number? How much money would you have to make in order to retire, quit the day job, and just kick the feet up? Also, is there a possibility that you might move for tax purposes to make sure that you claim some of that money back from the government for capital gains taxes? Because, yes, unfortunately, there are only 2 things that are guaranteed in life, and that's death and taxes. Unfortunately, I wish I could say that Bitcoin pumping is a guarantee, but it's more of a theory for now. Anyways, what events happen if you blow past your expectations? What happens to your life? How does it change? Could it affect your psychology and how you think about money? Does getting money from these outside sources change how you feel about it? So, how much money would it take for you to quit your day job? There's a couple things that come with this one. Can your nest egg of crypto gains replace stable income? Could you use something like the FIRE model to determine if it's even possible or how much money you need to start this model? And lastly, do you actually gain anything from your day job besides just money? Purpose, friends, social circle, accomplishment? Maybe you just like what you do. That's totally fine too. The FIRE model stands for Financially Independent Retire Early. This is the idea that you have such a large nest egg and you can count on some market growth that you turn your crypto gains into stable gains over time, such as stocks, bonds, S&P 500, maybe even gold or something more stable like that. So with this being said, some of the assumptions of the model is that there's an annual growth of 8% averaged out over 10 years. Some people in the past have talked about how it's closer to 10%, but there's also reasonable data suggesting that it's starting to slow down as time goes on. So we'll stick with 8%. The reason that you have 8% is half of that 8% is for you to live on, and the other half is to combat pesky inflation. So obviously, if you do the math, that means 4% inflation at the most. If you've looked at the charts recently, you would know that we are well above 4% inflation over the last 2 years. To buy what you would have bought with $1 in 2019 would take about $1.20 today. So with that being said, let's assume that you want an annual living budget of $100,000. That means that your nest egg has to be $2.5 million. Like I said previously, inflation is assumed to be 4% and growth is assumed to be 8%. If these are not true, then guess what? This is where that massive disclaimer comes in, and this model might be suffering a little bit, and it's a possibility you have to get that day job back.
Fuck you, fuck you, you're cool, and fuck you, I'm out.
On to our second question. How much of a tax break does it take for you to move to a place that is tax advantageous? If you're in the United States like myself, you'll know that the U.S. federal capital gains taxes has 2 options. First off, there's short-term capital gains tax, which is 35%. Ugh. And not great, but definitely better than that, which is long-term capital gains tax at 20%. The difference between these two is that if you hold an asset for more than a year before trading it or having a taxable event with it, then that means that you qualify for long-term. Anything less than a year, that's short-term. So it pays to hold long-term and have a plan for the future. And lastly, there are also states with capital gains taxes. Fun fact, there are 11 states that do not have capital gains taxes. Put your guess down in the comments about what you think it is, or if you know one of the answers and live there. Although, don't dox yourself if you don't have to. Now it's time for the moon math. Let's get to it. So to start off, I am assuming a pretty moderate profile with some speculative bets in certain other things. You'll see here, whoop, we have Bitcoin and Ethereum making up 50% of our portfolio. This is just good practice because honestly, these are probably the only 2 cryptocurrencies that show that they have staying power so far. They're weighted at 10% and 40%, and that's because, personally, I think that Ethereum is more the workhorse, and Bitcoin is a store of value, so We're going to chase some gains with Ethereum, which are honestly probably pretty locked in. Bitcoin, we're going to keep it 10%. Moving into the experimental portion of the portfolio, we're going to start off with Phantom. It is an L1 coin that has been around for about a year or two, and we have it about 10%. L1s do very well, specifically in their first cycle, if they find mass adoption and product market fit. So we're going to leave that at 10%. Just like that, we're going to put 10% into Pulse Chain. We do like Richard Hart products here after all, so how could I not include this one in our speculative portfolio? Lastly, we have Hex at 20%. Hex is one of the best ways to onboard people into crypto, in my opinion, because it's such a great translation. It is a certificate of deposit, which is the second most popular financial asset at the bank, and you can do it on blockchain now, and it's real DeFi. So we're going to put 20% in that. We'll include part of that weighting due to some staking potentially, or also just because this coin has been also around since about early 2020, and it showed that it has some staying power. Lastly, you'll notice that I have one more speculative coin here, talking about GameFi with Illuvium at 10%. Again, that's the experimental portion. This is the core up here. 50% of our portfolio is what we call the guarantees. Again, nothing's guaranteed, but that's what we're going to get into. All right, time for Moon Math. So, looking at this table, you might be wondering where I came up with these numbers. Well, I pulled them straight out of my ass. And by that, I mean I swagged them. These are scientific wild-ass guesses. I looked at what might be a decent entry price. I'm not assuming you bought absolute bottoms, and I'm not assuming you're going to sell absolute tops. So let's look at the numbers that I pulled up for the chart. First off, we got Bitcoin. I'm assuming that we're going to do a 4x. We buy in at 30K, and we sell out at 120K. Bitcoin can keep going up to, 130, 150K. It's possible. Again, this is Moon Math. We're hoping for good numbers here, but at the same time, we're not going too crazy with it. Up next, we got Ethereum. You bought in at 1,500 and you get out at 8K. That's a 5X. Next up, Phantom. L1s have a history of doing up to 100X possibly, so we gave a conservative 20X. This means that you took your 30-cent Phantom and sold it out at $6. Up next, we have Pulse Chain. Pulse Chain is a brand new L1 that came out in 2023, and it could do very well and hit that 100x like we just talked about. So assuming that you bought it at 0.00006 cents, which it has been hovering and bouncing between for a hot minute ever since the SEC decided to sue Richard Hart for very strange accusations. Anyways, we're assuming that this doesn't even hit 1 penny, which a lot of people are talking about. So that's 100x right there. Lastly, we have Hex. Hex did have the bit of a stock split, so to speak, when Pulse Chain was launched because we had the fork of Ethereum, and the price between Hex on Ethereum and Pulse Chain reflects as much, so we'll assume that it doesn't quite get as high. Basically hits its all-time highs again of about 50 cents, but if you can consider that it's basically double the supply, that means that if it was still one coin, it would be about $1. Lastly, we have Illuvium. Our Illuvium play does pretty decent. Not the 100x or crazy stuff we talked about, but it hits about 3,000. 3,000 is about double where the all-time high previously was at $1,800, and we'll assume that we got it in for $60. Illuvium kept bouncing around that 40 for bottoming out for a long portion of time, and there's a good chance that you probably bought in down there. So looking at the portfolio, just without looking at a broad dollar amount put in, that means using this portfolio and the estimates that we got for our gains, this is a 29.4x portfolio, almost a 30x. That's, I gotta say, that sounds fantastic. This is Moon Math for a reason. All right, so if you had $1,000, that means that your Bitcoin would have been $100 turned into $400. Your Ethereum would have been $400 turned into $2,000. Your Phantom would have been $100 to $2,000. Pulse would have been $100 to $10,000. Hex would have been $200 to $10,000. And Illuvium would be $100 turned into $5,000 as well, granting your $1,000 portfolio into $29,400. I went ahead and ran the numbers for the rest of the portfolios. These are just some pretty decent ballparks. So we got 10K, 25K, and 100K. You'll see that even at 10K, you start getting well into those into those six figures. 25K, again, you're almost hitting 7. And if 100K, you are hitting those 7 figures and with a pretty healthy margin too. So with that being said, what would your taxes look like if one of these was your portfolio? Well, this is the table of sadness, I'm going to call it. So if you had that 1K portfolio, that means that you have a taxable amount of about $28,000. Everything, the taxable amount is effectively just your gains minus your starting portfolio, because, fun fact, the government already taxed you 7 ways to Sunday on the money that you already got through income tax, sales tax, everything else, you know. So, if we look at the long-term tax, this is the better of the two taxes. I'm not going to call it a good one, but it's the better one. We see that you are paying the government $5,680. That's a pretty penny, but is this something that's going to get you to motivate yourself to make changes later on? We'll see. Short-term tax at 35%. Now we see some pain points. This is $9,940. So basically, your take-home at the end of this is you turn $1,000 into $21,000. I mean, that's still damn good, I'm not going to lie. So it's hard to shake a stick at that. As we move down the portfolios, 10K, you're starting looking at about 50K and 100K respectively to the government. And then once you hit 25K, we start breaking into the six figures. We had $142,000 with the lower one, and we have $250,000 with the 35%. And the granddaddy of them all, after you have made yourself almost $3 million, you now owe the government $500,000 if you use the long term, and you owe them basically $1 million if you use the long term. Like I said, this is the table of sadness for a reason, and these numbers kind of hurt.
Oh my gosh. Where's all your money gone, Daddy?
Taxes. 9, 10, 11. Let me fix my houses. But it's okay. It's part of the game. No, it is.
So, what can you do about it? Well, fortunately for you, especially if you're a U.S. citizen or anyone with a passport, there are certain tax havens out there. I'm not telling you to not pay your taxes. Obviously, follow the laws of the countries that you live in. However, think smart, think like a millionaire, think like the rich. How do you protect yourself from a tax liability? One of the answers is you can just go to a place where there's no capital gains tax. If you're a U.S. resident, you can go to Puerto Rico, no passport required. If you're a resident there, you pay 0 capital gains taxes. However, there are a few stipulations. First off, it takes 6 months of residency, basically being in the place you want to be a resident, to get your residency. Then, you also have to make sure that you are a resident for the year that you want. However, if you do become a resident in the year that you are filing taxes, it does go from 20% to 10% for long-term capital gains taxes. And then, once you're a resident, there's 2 stipulations you have to meet. First off, you have to spend half of the year in Puerto Rico, so 6 months. Although, then again, if you're moving here, chances are that you're, taking it a little bit easier, so it's not too shabby. Lastly, 3 years minimum as a resident. Otherwise, you're going to owe the IRS back taxes for all those capital gains, which means you got to be committed and you got to make sure that your number incorporates 3 years. So, how much would it take you to move to one of these places for 3 years? That's the question we're asking. Lastly, there are 2 relatively tropical islands. Well, one is a tropical island, one is a country in Central America. We have Belize and the Cayman Islands. They also have no capital gains taxes, but they do have more hoops to jump through, and unfortunately, they might not be as first world as the United States or somewhere else that you may come from. So with that being said, it's going to be a bit of a life transition, and the process to get residency and start claiming your capital gains taxes might not be the easiest. So ask yourself this. How much money would it take for you to move to Puerto Rico? Would it take, the $100,000 from a 10K short-term 35% capital gains tax? Or maybe you're looking at that 25K portfolio with the long-term. Or you are that top-tier 100K. You're looking at paying the government anywhere between $500,000 to a whole $1 million. I mean, granted, at the same time, you did just make $3 million. So what is $1 million? Other than about 35% of what you just made. So, I don't know. These are just questions to ask yourself.
Paying taxes.
You'll be smitten. Meow.
If you are asking these questions, though, there is a great resource out there. Over on the Degen Roundtable, we had a special guest episode with published author and IRS former agent Christine Stevenson. She talks about how to avoid trouble with the IRS. Also the name of her book. Fun fact, it's like $3 or $4 on Audible, and the paper copy is not much more than that. So pick it up if you're interested in. So, If you are a self-employed gig worker or indie contractor, a book like this might come in very handy as you transition from maybe being a W-2 employee to being your own boss and having to deal with all of the tax implications yourself. Additionally, if you are interested in hearing a summary of the book, we had a book club episode just before this as the tie-in to the guest episode. And lastly, we talked about psychology of money. How you get money does affect how it affects you and how you spend it or even think about it, or your habits moving forward. One of the ways that you can learn how this mentality works is by joining the book club next Friday, January 14th, for The Millionaire Next Door. This is an excellent book that looks at what do millionaires, like net worth millionaires in the US, actually look like, and what are their habits. Additionally, there are several chapters that even talk about how gifting money to your children might affect how they think about money and how they finance, budget, work, or even incorporate into their daily lives. So, with that said, join us over at the Degen Roundtable. And by the way, if you're coming from the Hex Conference, thank you very much. We love having you here. So go ahead and do us all a favor, hit that like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for future videos to come. And with that said,
hasta la vista, baby.
We're out of here, baby.